Hey guys, Unfrequented World, and this is another My Bigfoot Story episode. In this episode, we're going to do something a little different. Over the past couple of months since starting this series, I've received a number of viewer stories and reports of encounters that they've had themselves, and I just feel that it's really important that we share these stories. We never know what we could learn from someone else's encounter or experience. Just the smallest little detail could ring true with an experience we've had, or maybe we get a few dozen of these reports that all state the same thing. So I think it's, as an avid researcher myself, I read and get my hands on anything and everything I can Bigfoot. So I think that these stories that are coming in need to be shared. So what I'm going to do this week is I've contacted the person who sent me the last story. They were fine with me sharing it. And I'm just going to go ahead and read that account to you guys. It really rang a bell with me in terms of my own experience, which was the screaming entity in the woods, which got me into this whole project of My Bigfoot Story. My incident was 20-some years ago, and this fella's experience was very similar to my own. So I also want to encourage you guys, if you have a story or an encounter or something that you would love me to share on the channel, something that just needs to get out there, by all means send it to me, message the channel, email me, whatever, guys. I'm sure there are a lot of people who watch the channel that want these stories, the truth, real things, real encounters that have happened. And by all means, share them with me and I will share them on the channel. So without further ado, here's our first My Bigfoot Story viewer encounter. Gary, I just recently discovered your channel and have started working my way through your Bigfoot videos. Hearing your story about the howl has encouraged me to share with you my own Bigfoot story. I am a few years older than you, I believe, 51 in a few weeks. What happened to me happened in 1989 in Pennsylvania. I had been hiking the Blackfoot Trail, our third time on the trail, near Slate Run, Pennsylvania with a couple of buddies from my hometown. It was early in the year, spring break for them from college. I had just recently gotten out of the Army and hadn't yet started my freshman year. We were on the ridge overlooking the village of Slate Run, PA, about halfway up the hill. We had driven all morning and a good part of the day from our houses in Ohio to the trailhead, so it was early afternoon before we parked my buddy's old Ford Fairmont wagon and set out with the enthusiasm and blissful ignorance of young men in their early 20s. Our enthusiasm quickly dimmed, though, when we discovered that the cable bridge that crossed the little creek, Slate Run, between the trailhead and the small mountain up the trail, had washed out since our last visit, and now the snow melt had swollen the little creek to a rushing little river of icy water. After assessing our situation for a few minutes, we repacked our gear to make sure everything was as waterproof as we could make it, took off our socks and boots, and we waded through the thigh-deep water, bracing ourselves on the downstream side with our hiking sticks so as not to be swept away in the strong current. Luckily, the crossing went well, and after a short break to get dry footwear back on, we continued up the trail. The sun was hanging low in the sky by the time we had climbed the switchbacks up to the halfway point on the hill. It had been a long day, and we were pretty tired by then, so we decided to take advantage of the first decent campsite we came to. We made camp. I cleared a spot and set up the tent, while my buddies started collecting firewood. Before long, we had a really nice pile of dry wood, mostly winter blowdown, I think. I'm guessing we were the first people backpacking that part of the trail since the previous autumn, or at least the first since the bridge washed out. The campsite was long established and well used in previous seasons. Although we hadn't used it ourselves during our previous trips, we knew it was there and we were relieved to see all the firewood close by. It didn't take us long to get a solid fire going, hang up the wet clothes, settle in for a nice relaxing evening playing cards and eating some MREs that I had brought home from the Army. It had been unseasonably warm, highs in the high 60s or maybe even 70s, so the combination of no one else on the trail, too early in the season for mosquitoes, and beautiful weather made for the amazing evening. We sat around and shot the breeze, but as the sun was going down, the wind picked up a bit after a while. Even with the fire, it was starting to get a little chilly. So we headed into the tent to finish playing cards. Sometime around 8 or 9, I'm guessing, we were just about wrapping up our card game when it happened. The yell. That horrible, life-changing yell. At first I didn't hear it as much as I felt it in my chest. The pitch was low like the barely audible rumbling of a big diesel locomotive in the distance. but it quickly increased in pitch and volume. I guess if I had to describe it, I would say it was a hoo-ah sound, but that hardly does it justice. As the howl continued on and the pitch increased, it became more of a shriek, sounding more and more desperate the louder it got, eventually reaching a blood-curdling scream, like a giant baby crying. It was ragged and plaintive, if that can somehow make any sense. My guess is it lasted for around 15 seconds or so. To this day, I can't fully wrap my head around the reality of an animal that could have made that sound. I was immediately terrified. Heart racing, I had to force myself to breathe slowly to avoid hyperventilating. All these years later, I remember that probably the most clearly, the forced, slow breathing and my heart rate. As a rule, I never hike in black bear country unarmed. I was carrying a 44 mag Ruger Red Hawk. My hand immediately went to it, and yet I had serious doubts it was big enough for whatever was making that sound. A 44 and a 500-pound black bear? Yeah, not as good as a 30-06, but enough to get my point across to the bear. But not whatever was making that sound. No, I was pretty sure that shooting whatever it was would most likely just make it really, really displeased with me, resulting in my being beaten to death with my own detached arms. So the three of us in the tent exchanged worried looks and whispers. Gary, I need to stress that even as young men, we were fairly experienced hikers. We weren't woodsmen or survival experts, mind you. No Morris Kochanski in my group. No, we were basically rural kids who spent a lot of time outside and hiked and camped and canoed. At this point in time, I was fresh out of the army. I had been in the infantry. I was in fantastic shape back then, and right up until that moment, I thought I was the most badass thing on that hill. A young man filled with testosterone and carrying a big dang gun. Except as it would turn out, I wasn't the big man on the mountain that night, and that came as a hell of a shock to me. You see, we were terrified, all three of us. That sound struck a chord in some primitive part of my brain. This was a primal fear, and we were in quite a predicament. We were way too far from the car to turn and run. It was too dark to run anyhow, and with only a thin nylon tent between us and it, we were basically stuck there until daybreak. So our course of action? Ignore it, mostly. We decided to talk loudly and try to sound scary ourselves. No scary thing in the dark. We're not afraid of you. Ha! Basically, we talked and laughed in our deepest, machoist voices for another 20 to 30 minutes. The entire time, terrified out of our wits. After maybe 45 minutes or so, having heard no more screams, we convinced ourselves we had scared it off. And eventually, after another 90 minutes, slowly calming down, we all drifted off to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard one of my friends rustling in his sleeping bag. He was getting up to take a leak. I had to as well, so slowly and comically, I might add, unzipped the tent and peeked out. Seeing nothing, we cautiously crept out of the tent and surveyed our immediate surroundings. What a sight that must have been, us climbing out of the safety of the tent, because tents are magically protective from scary things in the dark. To our great relief, all appeared well in camp. We threw some more wood on the fire, and then we took turns relieving ourselves while the others scanned the area with our flashlights. While my friend was relieving himself, I was standing a short distance away, shining my flashlight around when suddenly, approximately 50 yards up the ridge to the north, my flashlight caught the reflection of two large yellow circles. My first thought was that it was a trailhead and had been marked with two yellow driveway reflectors. For night hiking. Wait, what? What does that? I've never seen trails marked with driveway reflectors. Paint, sure, but not driveway reflectors. Well then, what the heck? Owl eye shine? Nah, not quite right. Too big, too far apart. The owl would have to be a lot closer for the eyes to appear that big, and I'd be able to see the body in the flashlight beam. Nope, definitely not eyes. Has to be driveway reflectors. About then, I heard my friend finishing up and asked him to shine his flashlight where I was shining mine. As he swung his beam toward where mine was pointing, his picked up another set of reflectors, about a foot lower and to the right of the first set. Weird. Why in the world would somebody put 4 driveway reflectors up in the trees? And then the first set blinked, and that really bothered me. It made it real at that point, a living creature, definitely not driveway reflectors. So we stood there, the four of us, staring at each other while my buddy and I discussed this recent development. At this point, our friend in the tent heard us talking and woke up. He asked what was going on, and we asked him to come out of the tent and to bring the guns. So there we were, the 5 of us, standing in the dark on that ridgeline, staring at each other in the bizarre standoff. Eventually, we gathered the courage to investigate and decided to slowly move in the direction of the eyes. We took turns, hopscotching each other, so someone always had a flashlight on the eyes. We had walked approximately 10 yards when one of the set of eyes disappeared. We thought we heard the sound of running, but we couldn't be sure. The other set of eyes remained stationary, but then after we had moved maybe another 5 yards, it disappeared as well. The three of us stopped, skinned, and briefly picked up eye shine further out, maybe 60 or 80 yards north-northwest, as if it was going to move down the west side of the ridge towards the creek. We continued on and walked to the spot we estimated the eyes were when we first spotted them and looked for footprints. None. Or scratches on the tree. None. The ground was covered in thick, spongy moss. We could find no prints. We weren't making prints either. Still thinking it was owls or maybe raccoons, I looked for a branch that they had been sitting on, but nothing seemed to fit. After maybe 5 minutes of looking around, we headed back for the tent. About halfway back, one of us spotted eye shine again, but this time on the other side of the camp. Something had come around behind us and was watching us from the other side. I can't really explain what came over us, other than to say that we were now pretty mad and all jazzed up on adrenaline. So taking a page out of the movie Ghostbusters, you know the scene in the basement of the library? Yeah, well, we decided to rush it. Okay, in hindsight it was just stupid, and unlike considering how scared we had been earlier, but out in the open, armed, we felt better. Anyhow, we had run as fast as we could, yelling the entire way, but during our run we lost sight of it and never did see or hear anything else that night. We stayed up a while longer making lots of noise and built up the fire to pretty scary proportions. We never did discharge our weapons. We never got close enough to make any sort of positive ID on anything anyhow. We took turns staying up tending the fire, rotating 2 of us awake and 1 asleep. We broke camp at sunrise and headed up the ridgeline. Sadly, the weather turned sooner than we were banking on and we had to cut the trip short. The only other item of interest were a tree near a cave opening we found. We did not explore the cave. Snow had begun to fall. A heck of a change in the weather. The tree was interesting because it was approximately 18 inches in diameter, stripped entirely of bark and missing the rest of the tree, approximately 8 or 9 feet up. The top of the tree was simply gone, nowhere to be seen. Something had shredded the tree, leaving a ragged, splintered break and the trunk stripped of bark. We spent a couple of minutes looking for the rest of the tree, but it was not to be found. Ultimately, it was lucky we got off the trail when we did, because by the time we got back to the car and drove to the nearest town, a full-on blizzard was raging and they were shutting down the roads. We got a hotel. When we woke up the following morning, over a foot of snow had fallen. It took me years before I set foot anywhere remote again. I didn't really go into the woods until my son started into scouting, and even then I only went with groups. It's just been in the last couple of years I've decided to do any solo backpacking, and even now I look at things differently. I view my place in the food chain differently. So there you go, that's my story. Was it Bigfoot? No. Bigfoot isn't real, right? To be honest, I don't know what it was. I wish I did. I'm not going to say it haunts me to this day, but the memory is still very much with me. Anyhow, keep up the good work. Love the channel. Take care. Don in Ohio.